Guys, this is the moment of truth. Last year when we started out with this channel, the idea was not only to read the Bible or just to look at the language, but was to come to a point where we could actually interpret what we're reading. In Jewish thinking, this process is referred to as a midrash, or in plural, a midrashim, and this literally means the way that we analyze the text to make meaning. And I would like to suggest that we try to hear the text as if the original authors were speaking to an original audience. We are not the original audience, neither are we close to the original authors. There's a huge amount lost in translation between what the original authors meant to what the original audience heard. Fast forward to what we hear today. And we call this kind of the theological interpretation or the theological analysis of what we're reading. But let's begin by saying, I'm not stupid enough to think that my interpretation is the correct interpretation, but I'm also not clever enough to think much further than what I can see at this moment. Can we agree that what I'm about to share with you today is a template for how I go about reading the text and interpreting the text from a theological point of view? But going forward, my journey will change, your journey will change. So this is the one thing. Let's take this as an example process, as an example method, how to use the language and actually read it with understanding. Okay, this is the one point. And secondly, what I want to say is, luckily, the reading of the Bible is not void of the Spirit of God. In fact, I want to go as far as to say, if you're only going to apply language rules and use your knowledge about ancient Hebrew, you will still be stuck. What we need is revelation that can only come from God's Spirit. So the good news is we are not some exclusive group that has better or deeper insight, but I think the knowledge of ancient Hebrew and the process of understanding where the ancient Hebrew alphabet and the language comes from and how it has evolved over time does give us a little bit of an inroad how to read and interpret the text. So all of these things said, let's jump straight into Genesis 1 verse 1 and see what is it that we can extract from there. We've got Genesis 1 verse 1 open, and the first comment that I want to make is the very first word in the Bible breaks the pattern, BERESHIT. BERESHIT is not a verb, and as we've discussed, Hebrew sentences normally start off with a verb. In this case, we have an adverbial phrase, in other words, a phrase that clarifies the verb, and right after that we have the verb Bara, and from there onwards it follows the normal, quote-unquote, normal pattern that Hebrew sentences follow: verb, subject, object. But BERESHIT is such an enormous adverbial phrase, by lack of a better word, that we need to stop and pay close attention to the author's intention of focusing us on this word BERESHIT. It's a big word. And as we've said in the syntax part, BERESHIT starts off with a prefix beit, that means in, at, or with, and then there's a noun called RESHEIT, which has a root word resh or rosh, which is the word for head. Right there, the theological statement that the Bible opens with is to say in, at, or with something. Right, and this is the word RESHEIT. Now, I've looked at numerous biblical commentaries, and by the way, if you Google BERESHIT or if you Google Genesis 1 verse 1, you will get so many profound and some less profound opinions about BERESHIT. But what I want to say is, the author wants us to know that there's a space-time implication here. There's a positioning of opinion. There's a perspective, an opening of perspective that we cannot ignore. BERESHIT. Now, normally it is translated as in the beginning. But beginning is but one of the interpretations of RESHEIT. Yes, there is the idea of a head, of a summit, of a first. And one reading could be to say in the first or in the beginning. That is one interpretation. But it could also be read as with the first, which has a Christological or a messianic implication, which could mean that right there we have that before it mentions God, before it mentions the verb of a single male performing an action, it says that with the first. In other words, with the Messiah. That could be an implication. But as Jeff Benner unpacks this in his mechanical translation, it could also mean at the summit of things. And what does summit means for us? It means the only place or only dot in space and time that has any meaning for us, because prior to that has no meaning for mankind. It has no meaning for the reader because we're not there, we're human. The theological implication there is to say, guys, before that point in time, it has no implication for us. There is nothing that we can deduct from that because there is nothing that we can interpret or understand beyond our current reality. And this is the theological power of BERESHIT. It says that in summit or in the apex, at the highest point for our understanding, on the one end or on the other end, with the first, with the beginning, which could mean the Messiah. Bank, next word, Bara. Bara is the verb for a single male performed an action that is in the past. In other words, the action is completed. And in this case, the word Bara could be read as making something. The actual verb, the meaning of the verb could mean one male made something. That is the one reading of Bara. But if we take all the occurrences of the word Bara, we find that other readings of Bara implies a change or a fashioning of something, almost an evolution, if I may use the word. A transformation of something, a process verb, taking something from one shape and morphing, molding, fashioning it into a more complex or a more evolved state. So one single male finished a process at apex, at summit, with the beginning. One male performed an action. It's almost as if the first two words in the Bible gives us context to say, you're about to hear a story, but let us just tell you what the story will implicate, what the story will mean. BERESHIT, Bara, and now it tells us the subject. Who is this single male who performed something? And then it gives us a plural word, Elohim, and we've talked about this. In Hebrew, the implication of a plural word is not necessarily in number. It means God in a plural state, God in a complex state, a state that you and I cannot get our grip on. And then we know that the root word for Elohim is the word El, which means He's our strong shepherd. He's the ox that leads us. So we're the first at the summit, created God. God created, God fashioned, God made something over time. It sets the stage. BERESHIT, bara, Elohim. And then we come to the fourth word, which is a marker in Hebrew, pointing us to the direct object, but it does not get translated in English, so it's omitted in translations. But the word eight in Hebrew, aleph tav, in itself raises so many interesting theological questions. Aleph tav is the first letter and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And you can hear where this goes, Alpha and Omega in Greek, where Yeshua says, I'm the first, I'm the last, I'm the beginning, I'm the end. So Aleph Tav, most probably, from an Hebraic perspective, is the etymological source for Alpha and Omega in Greek. Aleph Tav, the first and the last. And we know that the word et is a direct object marker. So it is, if you take the Hebrew letters Aleph Tav, it's the strength of the covenant. It's the strong marker. BERESHIT bara Elohim et, strong marker. And then Hashemayim ve'et haaretz. Hashemayim in Hebrew is the word for the heaven or the skies. But what we must understand is, for the ancient Hebrews, the heavens or the skies almost meant the there, Hashemayim. The word sham in Hebrew is the word for there. I'm pointing something out. And again, Shemayim is a plural state. So it could mean the there in a dual or a plural state. And we've mentioned that in the syntax video. And what I can't go into now is the possible theological implications of Hashemayim, because if you read this from an ancient perspective, it has cosmological commentary built into that. What is the heavens? Because if you go to Genesis 1 verse 8, then it tells you that the heavens and the firmament is the same thing. So without going into cosmological detail here, right there in Genesis 1 verse 1, BERESHIT bara Elohim et Hashemayim, it tells us the heavens or the skies has a theological implication in that the way that the ancients viewed the world was that there was a dome over us. Read Genesis 1 verse 8 and you see even the translators struggle. They pick words, but they grapple with this thing. What exactly are the heavens? Very interesting question. We move on. Ve'et. In other words, and another direct object, haaretz. And haaretz is a simple word in Hebrew, means the earth or the ground, that on which the ancients have lived. For me, the juxtaposition of God created or God fashioned, right in the beginning or with the first, He fashioned the skies and the earth. It almost represents the two spheres of reality for the ancients, that on which we live and that which we can almost not reach right now. This is one simple approach, one midrash almost, to say what can we take from that. There are layers and layers and layers, like peeling an onion, that we can explore, and we will. But the reading of Genesis 1 verse 1 right now is just to demonstrate what is a possible handling, what is a possible dealing of the scriptures. BERESHIT bara Elohim et ha-shamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, in other words, that point in time, space, that point in the four dimensions that we can grasp, length, width, and depth, but also a timeline, right where that starts for us, God created. It's almost telling us, we're about to tell you a story, but you need to see the backdrop. It's almost like watching a movie and there's a little paragraph that comes up just to tell you what's the context of this. My opinion of Genesis 1 verse 1 is that there is an enormous amount of cosmological information handed out, and it's almost holding the tension just to tell you in 7 words, whether first or at the apex, at the summit, as Jeff Benner calls it, right there at the top, the only point that we can begin to make sense of things. Right there, a single male, Elohim, fashioned, He finished over time something, and then it tells you, what did He finish? What did Elohim finish? He finished the skies or the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2 will start to unpack that. And this is what we call Eastern logic versus Western logic. It tells us the context and then goes into the context and starts unfolding the details of that context, which we'll explore in our following videos. But for now, is this the comprehensive reading? Not at all. I'm not that naive. You will read a lot of commentaries, you will read a lot of midrashim from Jewish sages who will go much deeper into these things. And by the way, this is why the Jewish people read the entire scripture, the entire Torah every year. And every year that they go around this proverbial circle of dissecting the text and the possible meaning of the text, they go deeper. Because depending on where you are on your journey and depending where I'm on my journey, I will hear something different. And this is the beauty of an infinite creator speaking to us through a language which just holds so much beauty and so much mystery. I hope this is helping. And by the way, we will go faster now because this is literally just explaining to you a template of how we will go deeper. What will you need from this point onwards? You will need a Strong's Concordance, and you will need probably to have your alphabet and your meanings of the little letters open in front of you, so that you can start not only reading and pronouncing the text, not only looking at the language, but begin to ask, what exactly is going on? What is this trying to tell me? What is this trying to explain to me? What is this trying to break open to me to make sense of what the text is saying? And the final point I want to make for today, I once had a mentor who pointed out a very interesting sequence of how we could possibly read the text. And one of the things that he mentioned is, it's really dangerous to begin by asking, what is the text saying to me? I gotta ask the first question, what is the possible hearing that the original audience could have heard the original author saying? Okay, that's number one. The second point I think we should ask about every passage is this passage telling me something about the Mashiach? Something about God's plan for mankind? Something about God's salvation story unfolding? So first, original author, original audience. Second point, is it pointing me in the direction of something Christological, something messianic? And thirdly, I can start by asking, what can I make of this for my context, for my life? I think sadly we often start by asking, what is this saying to me? And then we almost hijack the scriptures to speak to us in a way that excludes understanding and excludes the beauty of interpreting the scriptures from an Hebraic perspective. I hope this is helpful, and we will look at Genesis 1 verse 2 and 3 and 4, and then jump to other scriptures which are more known, like Psalm 23 and others, and see, can we apply these reading, syntax, and also theological interpretation rules to other passages? And this is the way we will go forward. Be blessed until next time. Ciao.